Okay, so today we're going to read Chapter 1, The Killer Nurse by John Fox John. Chapter 1 is titled The Owl. It's pages 5 through 20. Lightning flashed and thunder filled the sky as citizens of Angelina County, Texas, somberly rushed to the courthouse on Thursday morning, March 29th, 2012. In addition to the county's residents, the horde included newspaper and TV journalists, local, state, and national, plus family and friends of the victims, as well as that of the defendant and of the lead defense attorney. The previous day, both sides of the trial had rested. All that was left in this historic case were the closing arguments and jury deliberation to see if Kimberly Clark Saenz would become the county's first serial killer, and if so, would the jury elect to send a woman to Texas's infamous death row. The trial had begun almost 4 weeks earlier when Saenz, an East Texas nurse, was charged with 5 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of capital murder. Saenz, a former nurse at the DeVita Lufkin Dialysis Center, was accused of having harmed or killed many of the dialysis patients under her care. There were 2 things that made this case unique and garnered the national attention. First, that 1 count of capital murder, a very serious charge that can carry the death penalty, actually included 5 murders. Second, the method Saenz was accused of using to injure and kill her alleged victims was by injecting the patients with bleach, and it had never been heard of before. As the rain poured down, drivers circled the courthouse looking for parking places that didn't exist. If they were hoping for someone would move, they were wasting their time. No one was leaving. The lucky ones who'd found parking spots earlier hurried through the downpour, anxious to get out of the rain and into the courtroom. Prior to Saenz's trial, the Angelina County Courthouse had employed no security, but now sheriff deputies patrolled the floor and 2 stood before the locked courtroom doors with metal detectors. In addition to the media firestorm that would be sure to erupt no matter what the verdict was, a recent courtroom shooting in nearby Beaumont, Texas, had everyone's nerves on edge. Then there was the young man who'd called the DA's office on the 2nd day of the trial and informed authorities that he was coming from Louisiana to get Kimberly Saenz. He eventually showed up in Lufkin, but Deputy Sheriff John Purvis and others were waiting. After patting the man down for weapons and not finding any, he eventually told them that he had heard about the trial on the news and he believed Kimberly Saenz had once tried to kill him. As it turned out, he had her confused with someone else. Although the threat didn't amount to anything, he'd been drawn by news reports of the trial, and in such a high-profile case, officials were actually aware that there were plenty of other chances for trouble. Cryptic comments and vague threats had also appeared on KTRE-TV's website from anonymous posters, apparently looking for vengeance against Saenz. Law enforcement took these comments and potential threats seriously, and Sergeant Luna with the Angelina County Sheriff's Department confirmed that they had a lot to do with the extra security. Tensions were high, even before the comments emerged, and the last thing the sensational trial needed was a violent incident in the courtroom. The strain of the trial had worn down everyone involved. As the weeks slipped past, the attorneys and their assistants' attitudes had withered from friendly to hard-jawed exhaustion. They now seemed to slump where they stood tall before. On that rainy Thursday morning, the courtroom was full. Sitting behind the prosecution were the families of the victims, and given the number of victims, there were a lot of family members, most of them whom believed that Saenz had killed or injured their loved ones. A smoldering rage seemed to burn under the surface, just waiting for a crack to escape. On the other side of the courtroom sat Saenz's supporters, her family and the members of her church who were fervent believers in Saenz's innocence and whose attitudes seemed to say that they would brook no disagreement. The combustible atmosphere spilled out beyond the courtroom doors, as did the rampant speculation about Saenz's guilt or innocence. People gathered in groups in the hallways to discuss what was happening inside, or rushed out during breaks to find a quiet place to make calls and send texts. In the coffee shops, restaurants, barber shops, and beauty salons, and even churches, everywhere people gathered, the debate raged that Saenz was guilty or not, and whether the jury would actually convict her. Citizens with no more experience of the law than what they'd seen on Law and Order were saying things like, the preponderance of evidence doesn't measure up to a conviction. In truth, the citizens of Angelina County overwhelmingly believed that Saenz was guilty but would walk out of the courtroom a free woman. According to the jailer who heard the remark, one inmate in the county jail awaiting transfer to prison for embezzlement of 6 figures from her employer said, "I got 13 years for stealing money and she killed 5 people and she's gonna get away with it." But of course, Kimberly Clark Sines' destiny wasn't in her hands. That would be up to the 12 of her peers. Angelina County has 2 district courts, and both of them are located on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. The 159th District Courtroom, the older, run-down one, sits in the front at the landing of the stairs. The 217th District Courtroom, the new, modernized one, is in the back of the 2nd floor. Originally, the trial was scheduled to take place in the newer courtroom, but during voir dire, Judge Barry Bryan changed the location. The older one was 3 times the size of the newer one, and he correctly assumed that they would need all of that space they had available. As it turned out, not even the older courtroom was large enough to accommodate all of the spectators. 2 small windows in the doors allowed people to peek in, but during the trial, the only peeking done was from TV cameras. Film crews were barred from the courtroom and had to make do with filming through the windows. Inside were 2 sections with a rail and a small swinging gate that separated the courtroom from the large spectator section. Besides a hint of stale sweat and urine, the 2 sections of pew-like seats with dirty, stained cushions, scratched and scarred from decades of use, dominated the back part of the courtroom. The walls on 2 sides were mostly comprised of dark paneling, and the wall to the east had large windows covered by dark Venetian blinds that allowed shards of light through. However, on this morning, with the rain and overcast sky, little light bled through, just enough to reflect eerily off the large marble slab on the wall behind the judge's bench. Sirens from the fire station a block away cut through the silence. Instead of dampening the mood of the spectators back into the room, the noise heightened the tension. The strain inside the courtroom dialed up several notches when 38-year-old Kimberly Clark Sines strolled in. Although facing a possible death sentence, her mood, either by design or temperament, didn't match the weather or that of the spectators. At approximately 5'4" and weighing in the neighborhood of 170, she had shoulder-length dark hair, parted on the side and held in place with a barrette. Heavy makeup helped hide acne scars. On this morning, she wore black slacks, a teal-covered blouse with a flowery embellished neckline under a dove gray blazer, and 3-strand necklace of large turquoise, olive, jasper, and pink stones. Waiting on Sines and the finish of the trial was 53-year-old Clyde Harrington, the district attorney for Angelina County. Harrington could best be described as pudgy, and when he walked, his feet pointed out at 45-degree angles. He wore glasses and his brown hair was thin, disappearing slightly at the back of the crown with only a splattering of gray mixed in. The veteran district attorney who was prosecuting his last big case before intending to retire at the end of this year led off with his closing arguments. In contrast to everyone else in the courtroom, his demeanor was soft and seemingly unaffected by the circumstances and the extreme anxiety and responsibility he shouldered. His words and body language had remained even-tempered throughout the trial, except when he caught a witness lying. Only then had he shown anger. For 30 minutes, Harrington reminded the jury about the 2 eyewitnesses, what they had seen, and how everything they had told the police and later testified to had proven correct. Harrington also showed sections of Kimberly Sines' taped interview with the police, including the part where, unprompted, she told them that she'd never researched bleach poisoning. The jury got to see that she had said this on her own, not as an answer to a police question. This interview had also revealed several things that were in direct contraindication to what Sines would later testify to the grand jury, including an acknowledgement that she'd used a 10 cc syringe to measure bleach, even though she knew she wasn't supposed to. Harrington next showed the interview with the grand jury, where Sines contradicted what she'd told the police, but did tell them that she thought that DeVita, her employer, was using her as a scapegoat. Harrington pointed out that in her first interview with the police, Sines didn't have an attorney to tell her what to say. He called the grand jury testimony the birth of the scapegoat theory. The DA also submitted pictures of all of the victims. While the jury had heard the names of 1,000 times, the pictures connected the dots for them, literally gave faces to the victims, making them human, not just statistics. It wasn't until Harrington finished the first part of his closing arguments and turned to the podium over to the defense attorney that he seemed to become tense. Ryan Deaton's reputation among his adversaries on the prosecution side was that he might misrepresent facts, and Harrington was bracing himself for it. Deaton's athletic physical appearance and young age contrasted sharply with Harrington. Deaton had a fashionable 3-day growth of hair on his face and stood a few inches over 6 feet with wide shoulders. There was a permanent scrape on his forehead just above the bridge of his nose. His shaved head, an apparent attempt to conceal early male pattern baldness, stood out, especially in the afternoons with a 5 o'clock shadow. Deaton's shaved head did more than hide his lack of hair. When he got angry or upset, a bright red splotch about 4 to 5 inches in diameter appeared on the left side of the back of his head, a dead giveaway that things weren't going his way. As Deaton began his closing argument, something occurred that left an undeniable impression. An owl hooted a couple of times just outside of the courthouse window. Deep East Texas is steeped in traditions and in some cases superstitions, one of which is that hearing the hoot of an owl during the day means imminent death. It is a superstition not only confined to East Texas. Many other cultures also look on the owl as an omen of death or disaster. For instances, the Romans believed that the death of the people such as Julius Caesar, Augustus, and several other famous leaders were predicated by the hoot of an owl. To those who believed in such things, it seemed ominous. But if Deaton heard the owl or knew about its significance, he didn't show it. He went on to speak for almost 2 hours with his closing, reiterating his main argument in support for Sines' innocence. He blamed DeVita and accused them of a cover-up, of using his client as a scapegoat. He reminded the jury that DeVita was a huge Fortune 500 company. He told the jury and the spectators about biblical goats and how the Jews would cast all their sins on the goat and send it out to die as a sacrifice to rid themselves of all their own sins. He compared this to what DeVita had done to his client. He begged the jury not to let this big company come into East Texas and snatch one of their own away from her home. They couldn't let a corporate giant blame this poor East Texas girl for her sins. Deaton also blamed the water in the dialysis center for the deaths and injuries to the patients. He pointed out that Sines was only one of 3 employees that were giving meds, and that this was how she was connected to all the patients. He told the jury that one of the witnesses had claimed that Sines injected 20 cc's of bleach, but that wasn't true. The witness never said how much bleach was in the syringe. What she'd actually said was that Sines had used 2 syringes. Deaton reminded the jury of how another witness had changed her testimony. In fact, he told the jury she had been told how to testify in the trial. He left out how she testified, that the instructions she received had been simply to tell the truth. The more Deaton spoke, the redder Harrington's face got and the madder he became. Still, Deaton wasn't done. He told the jury that the doctor overseeing the DeVita clinic hadn't cared enough about his patients to make them go to the hospital after it was reported that 2 patients had been injected with bleach. Deaton played the sympathy card, pointing out that his client was a daughter, a wife, and a mother of 2 children. He told the jury about how the police had unfairly snatched Sines from her trailer home, took her to the police station, and grilled her. When Deaton finished, so did Harrington's calm demeanor. He shot out of his seat like someone had hit his rear with a cattle prod. His first words set the tone for the remainder of the closing. This has to be the biggest case of misrepresented facts I've ever heard in my life. Indeed, Deaton's spin had been so egregious that Christine Bailey, the first alternate on the jury, later said she'd wanted to stand up and cheer when Harrington took the issue with Deaton's untruths. She wasn't alone. Quite a few people who had followed all of the trial agreed with her assessment. The more the angered Harrington spoke, the lower Deaton slumped in his seat. This was also noted by the jury. One thing I noticed when Clyde got up and started talking, I noticed Ryan just kept going farther and farther down in his chair. You know, that kind of stuck, said jury member Willie Wigley. Not so much that Clyde was saying, but Ryan's reaction to it. As Harrington talked, his seething anger turned into raw emotion, and the court saw another side to him, one that had not previously shown itself. It was obvious to all that the DA believed every fiber in his being that Kimberly Saenz was guilty, and he wanted her to pay for what she'd taken away from the families of the victims. With tears running down his face and his voice trembling, Harrington said something else that stuck with jurors and spectators alike, something that spoke directly to the question of motive. Why do mothers scald their babies? You don't need to know what evil is to recognize it. In other words, even if everyone knew all the reasons why Saenz had killed and injured these patients, they'd never understand them. When Harrington finished and sat, emotionally spent, not a single person in the courtroom breathed, not even the judge. Many attempted to choke back their own emotions. It was like a giant vacuum had sucked all the air out of the packed room. Moments passed before the judge was finally able to speak. Many who were in the courtroom that day, including other local attorneys who'd shown up just to watch the finish, said that Harrington's closing was one of the greatest they'd ever heard. 5 days later, the Lufkin News, in their Toast and Roast editorial, toasted Clyde Harrington for his impassioned plea to the jury just before it retired to deliberate its verdict. The article observed that you could tell as he choked up that he was determined to get justice for the victims' families, and not just because it was his last big case as district attorney. The newspaper then roasted defense attorney Ryan Deaton for his in-your-face closing arguments on Saenz' behalf. He crossed the line by bearing the state's witnesses as crazy and liars. However, if Deaton had raised any doubts about the prosecutor's evidence, and if his scapegoat theory about Fortune 500 DeVita held a sway in the minds of the jury of working class East Texans, then how he'd come across the closing argument was moot. His job was to get his client off, and if he accomplished that, he would be a hero, at least to some. The jury began deliberations at 1:30 and hours dragged. Little clusters of people, prosecutors, investigators, family members of the victims, and friends of the defense attorney were there to support him, gathered all around the second floor of the courthouse. Close to 5 p.m, the normal time that the jury left, a note came from the Saenz jury that they planned to deliberate until 7 that night, but when 7 came, the jurors left without having yet reached a verdict. Family members and friends of Saenz said this was the longest night in their lives. At 9 the next morning, the jury reconvened, but the morning dragged with no verdict. The same conversation as the day before swept through the groups. Do you think she's guilty? Will the jury let her go? But most of all, how long do you think the jury will take? Although no one had an answer to this question, most believed that the jury would have had a verdict by the evening, but that this was more of a desire than outright knowledge. After lunch on Friday, word passed from one group to another that the jury had taken care of 3 of the 6 charges. This seemed to revive the spirits of those waiting until someone mentioned that it may not mean anything. It depended on which charges they'd done. The person pointed out that one of those charges contained 5 murders. In order to convict Saenz of the capital murder charge, the jury would have to find her guilty of at least 2 of the 5 murders. Time passed like watching a turtle race. Some people attempted to work or read, but they, too, didn't fare well with their tasks. People's nerves were tottering on the edge, and those emotions weren't conducive to anything that required concentration. Finally, at 3:30, word swept through the second floor that the jury was almost done, which sparked a mass of cell phone calls to pass on the news. Still, it wasn't until Saenz, her family, and attorney showed shortly thereafter that the real hope began to thread its way through the gathering. Anticipation rose even higher when a long line began to form outside the courthouse doors. TV reporters with camera crews crowded close or stood on the steps out of the way, where they had a better view of the people waiting to get into the courtroom. Sheriff's deputies were again on hand blocking the doors with their handheld metal detectors. Anticipation crackled up and down the line that reached all the way to the end of the second floor. The news began to leap from mouth to mouth. The jury had reached a verdict. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened and the noise in the hallway vanished. As the line inched forward, the only noise became the loud beeps from the metal detectors, which had been turned to their most sensitive settings. Sign's immediate family took up their stations in the first two rows behind the defense table on the left. Just behind them sat Lisa and Van Kelly, the husband and wife investigative team hired by the defense. Along with them were friends of the defense attorney and friends and supporters from Sign's church. The right-hand side behind the prosecution table was filled with spectators and people who had assisted in the prosecution, but most of the seats were taken by the true victims in this case, family members of the people Signs was accused of killing. Their faces showed the strain they'd been through, and the family sat close together, bodies touching, black and white alike, maybe to garner some strength from the person next to them. Many of the family members of the victims sat with their arms wrapped around themselves, almost in a protective cocoon, while others sat visibly trembling. Several of these family members said that going in, they didn't know if Kimberly Signs was guilty or innocent. They just wanted the truth of what happened to their loved one to come out. Some said that if she was found guilty, they hoped that she wouldn't get the death penalty. Two family members pointed out that the rest of her life in prison would be much better because she'd have all that time to think about it. Death was too easy. Other family members said that only God had the right to put someone to death. Several said that either way, they would leave the verdict in the hands of God. He was the final judge, and he would impart unto the jury what they should do. With the family that Friday was Miss Marie Bradley, one of the surviving victims. Alongside Miss Bradley sat several ex-DeVita employees who also testified in the trial. Their attitudes seemed to be, "We cared for your loved ones and will stand by you now." The tension inside the courtroom was as thick as the East Texas humidity. People sat rigid in their seats, most leaning forward, some rocking slightly. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom went to Kimberly Signs as she entered, slumped slightly, her eyes red and swollen from crying, in stark contrast to her earlier appearance and demeanor throughout the trial. Most pictures taken by the paper or TV as the trial progressed had shown a woman laughing or smiling who appeared to be supremely confident she was about to be found not guilty. After Signs collapsed in her seat, everyone rose when Judge Barry Bryan entered. With silver hair and a beard with traces of gray showing through, the judge looked exactly as someone might picture a district judge to look. The judge had the ability to be stern when needed and even funny when appropriate. He took care of the jury, and the people who worked for him loved him. Everyone, even people who weren't that fond of him, agreed on one thing. Judge Bryan was fair. What better recommendation can a judge receive? As Harrington said later, "I don't always agree with his decisions, but I know that when he makes one, he has thought about it a lot." However, on this day, moments before the jury was to enter and deliver their verdict, Judge Bryan was neither stern nor funny, but solemn. After a warning to the spectators on how to behave themselves when the 6 verdicts were read, he indicated for the bailiff to bring in the jury. It was easy to tell the newcomers in the courtroom, mostly media from out of town, because the ones who'd followed the trial knew to rise when the jury entered. In the Angelina County Courthouse, the spectators rose out of respect for the jury, just as they did for the judge. As the 12 jurors and 3 alternatives filled in, some were visibly shaking. The women had scarred looks on their faces, and the men were somber. 2 closed their eyes while the others stared at the judge. All avoided looking at the spectators in the court or the defendant. When the judge asked the jury if the jury had come to a unanimous verdict, Foreman Larry Walker's voice cracked when he answered, "Yes, sir." Once the bailiff handed the verdict sheet to the judge, most of the jurors turned their heads and faced Signs as if they wanted to show their solidarity in the verdict. The judge asked Signs to rise. She got to her feet on wobbly legs. At her side was defense attorney Ryan Deaton on one side and Steve Tyler on the other. What Kimberly Signs' life would be like after this, no one could say at that moment. Even if the jury pronounced her not guilty, the mother of two, as well as her family, would always have to live with the lingering stigma that she was a serial killer who got away with it. However, the alternative would be that the owl was hooting about life in prison without a chance for parole, which meant Signs would leave prison in a box. Her life as she knew it would end in what would perhaps be a grim case of poetic justice. If Signs received the death penalty, she'd die by lethal injection, the same fate she'd allegedly given her victims. Seconds that felt like hours passed as Judge Bryan looked at the charge sheet and the verdicts, all 6 of them. 5 of the charges were for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Those were the only charges for which the jury would actually impose the sentence. The 6th charge was for all of the murders. The judge looked at Kimberly Signs and began to read the jury's verdict. That is the end of chapter 1. I would like you to think about the terminology that you heard in this chapter and compare it to that which we're learning in chapter 3 of medical law and ethics. I look forward to reading you more. Thanks.